In 1983, Jane Dalton buried her son and thought she'd buried her hope too. But 5 years later, a dream so vivid it felt like a warning grabbed her by the throat. A child's voice, desperate and scared, whispered from the darkness, "Mother, they're hurting us. Help." That night, Jane woke up shaking her gut, twisted with a fear she couldn't name. She knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just a dream. If you found this story moving and powerful, don't forget to hit that like button, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Brian, sweetheart, you're gonna be a big brother. Jane's voice trembled with joy as she knelt beside her 4-year-old son, her hands gently cupping his pale cheeks. The living room glowed with the soft light of a summer evening in 1983, the kind of light that made their small Ohio home feel like a haven. Brian's eyes, wide and curious, despite his frail frame, sparkled as he clutched his toy train. "A brother," he whispered, his voice thin but eager. Dave, leaning against the doorway with a rare grin, nodded. "That's right, champ. You'll have someone to play with just like you've always wanted." For a moment, the Dalton family was whole, wrapped in a fragile bubble of hope, until the phone rang sharp and shrill, shattering the warmth like glass. Jane's hand froze on Brian's shoulder as Dave crossed the room to answer. His face, moments ago alight with pride, tightened as he listened. "Yes, doctor, I understand. When can we come in?" His voice was low, strained, and Jane's stomach twisted. She stood, her hand instinctively resting on her swollen belly, where the baby Tommy they'd already named him kicked softly. Brian, oblivious, chugged his train along the carpet, murmuring to himself. When Dave hung up, he didn't turn to face her. "They need us at the hospital tomorrow," he said, his back still to her. "It's about the baby." Jane's breath caught and the room seemed to tilt. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dave's shoulders sagged, and when he finally looked at her, his eyes were hollow. They think he might have Down syndrome." The words hit Jane like a fist, stealing the air from her lungs. She sank onto the couch, her hands trembling as they cradled her belly. Down syndrome. She'd heard of it, of course, whispered about in church basements, seen in the pitying glances of neighbors when a special child passed by. But not her baby. Not their Tommy, who was supposed to be Brian's playmate, the one to fill their home with laughter. Brian, still lost in his game, looked up. "Mommy, why's Daddy sad?" Jane forced a smile, her throat tight. "He's just tired, honey. Go play. Okay?" Brian nodded, his small frame retreating to the corner of the room where he resumed his quiet game, unaware of the storm brewing between his parents. That night, after Brian was tucked into bed, Jane and Dave sat at the kitchen table, a single bulb casting harsh shadows across their faces. The joy of the evening had vanished, replaced by a suffocating silence. Jane stared at her coffee, cold and untouched, while Dave's fingers drummed against the table, each tap a reminder of the tension between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and jagged. "Jane, we need to talk about this. Really talk. What if we don't go through with it?" Jane's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Don't go through with it, Dave. This is our son. Our baby." Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if to hold herself together. Dave leaned forward, his face etched with desperation. "I know he's our son, Jane, but think about it. Brian's already so sick, his heart, the doctor visits, the bills piling up. We're barely keeping our heads above water. And now this. A child with special needs. How are we supposed to handle that? The doctor said it's gonna be hard. Really hard. Maybe it's kinder to let him go." His voice broke on the last word, and he looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Jane's hands clenched into fists, her nails biting into her palms. "Kinder. You think killing our baby is kinder? Dave? How can you even say that?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and unstoppable. I feel him moving inside me. He's alive. He's ours. Dave stood pacing the small kitchen, his boots heavy on the linoleum. I'm not saying it's easy, Jane. God knows I don't want this. But we've got to be realistic. We're not young anymore. I'm working double shifts at the factory and you're exhausted taking care of Brian. What kind of life can we give a kid who might need more than we've got? What if we can't do right by him or by Brian? His voice rose raw with fear and Jane flinched. She stood too, her chair scraping against the floor. So we just give up? Is that it? We let fear win. Her voice shook, but there was steel beneath it. I won't do it, Dave. I won't let this baby go. He's part of us no matter what. The argument stretched into the early hours, their voices a tangle of grief and anger, each word a wound. Jane's heart ached as she thought of Brian asleep upstairs, his fragile body curled under the blankets. He needed a sibling, someone to share his quiet world, to ease the loneliness that clung to him like a shadow. And Tommy? Her Tommy deserved a chance, didn't he? Dave's fears weren't wrong. She felt them too, gnawing at her in the dark. The money, the time, the endless doctor visits. But love had to be enough. It had to be. By dawn, they'd reached an uneasy truce. Dave sat slumped at the table, his face buried in his hands. All right, he said finally, his voice hoarse. We'll keep him. We'll figure it out. Jane nodded, her eyes red and swollen. She reached for his hand and he let her take it, their fingers interlocking like a lifeline. They didn't speak of love or hope. Those words felt too fragile now, but they'd made their choice, and it bound them together even as fear lingered in the air. The months that followed were a blur of anticipation and dread. Jane threw herself into preparing for Tommy, knitting tiny blankets and humming lullabies to her belly. Brian will have you soon, she'd whisper, her voice soft but fierce. You're gonna make him so happy. Brian, too young to grasp the weight of his parents' worries, grew excited, chattering about teaching his brother to play trains. Dave was quieter, his smiles forced, but he'd sit with Brian in the evenings reading stories in a low, steady voice as if anchoring himself to the present. When Tommy was born, the hospital room was quiet save for the soft beeps of machines. Jane held him close, her tears falling onto his tiny face. His eyes, so like Brian's, blinked up at her, innocent and trusting. He's perfect, she whispered, and for a moment she believed it. Dave stood beside her, his hand trembling as he touched Tommy's cheek. Yeah, he said, his voice thick. He's ours. They brought him home, and for a few precious weeks, the house felt alive again. Brian, weak but beaming, would sit beside Tommy's crib singing off-key songs and giggling when Tommy's tiny hand grasped his finger. Jane watched them, her heart swelling, daring to hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd be okay. But hope was a cruel thing. 6 weeks later, in the dead of night, Tommy's breathing grew shallow. Jane woke to his faint whimpers, her heart pounding as she scooped him from the crib. Dave, she screamed, her voice raw with panic. Dave stumbled from bed, his eyes wide with terror. They raced to the hospital. Dave's hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, Jane cradling Tommy in the back seat, whispering, "Stay with me, baby, please." The wail of the ambulance behind them was a sound she'd never forget, sharp and relentless like a blade cutting through her soul. At the hospital, doctors swarmed, their faces grim. Jane clung to Dave, her sobs muffled against his chest as they waited for news. But Tommy's heart, too weak to fight, gave out. He was gone. The drive home was silent, the empty car seat in the back a gaping wound. Jane stared out the window, her arms aching with the ghost of Tommy's weight. Dave's jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the road, but his hands shook on the wheel. At home, they found Brian awake, sitting on the stairs in his pajamas, his small face pale. "Where's Tommy?" he asked, his voice trembling. Jane knelt before him, her throat too tight to speak. He's with the angels now, sweetheart," she managed, pulling him close. Brian's arms wrapped around her, but he didn't cry. He was too young to understand, too young to carry the grief that now crushed his parents. In the days that followed, the house grew heavy with sorrow. Jane would sit by Tommy's empty crib, her fingers tracing the soft blankets, her tears falling silently. Dave threw himself into work, coming home late, his face drawn and distant. Brian played alone, his trains forgotten, his eyes often fixed on his mother, as if waiting for her to smile again. Jane tried for Brian. She tried, but the pain was a living thing clawing at her heart. She'd lost her baby, her hope, and the future she'd dreamed of. And Dave, her rock, seemed to be slipping away. His silence a wall she couldn't breach. One night, as rain pounded the roof, Jane sat in the dark, clutching Tommy's blanket. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." She didn't know who she was apologizing to, Tommy, Brian, Dave, or herself. All she knew was that the happiness they'd clung to, the dream of a family whole and unbroken, had been tested and found wanting. And yet, in the quiet of that shattered home, a small spark remained. Brian's soft footsteps echoed in the hall, his voice calling Mommy. She wiped her tears, took a shaky breath, and stood to face Dave, her heart heavy with the weight of their shared loss. "I don't know how to let them go," she admitted, her voice a broken whisper. And in that moment, the Dalton home, once filled with hope, felt like a mausoleum entombing their dreams of a family whole and unbroken. The months after Tommy's death in 1983 had been a fragile attempt to rebuild, with Jane and Dave pouring every ounce of their love into Brian, their 6-year-old son, whose heart condition kept him tethered to a world of hospital visits and quiet days. Brian, with his pale skin and bright eyes, was their anchor, his small smiles a reminder that they still had something to fight for. Jane would sit by his bed reading him stories of trains and adventures, her voice steady even as her heart trembled with fear of losing him too. Dave, ever the practical one, took on extra shifts at the factory, his hands calloused from work, his silence a shield against the grief that threatened to swallow them both. They believed, or perhaps convinced themselves, that love could outlast Brian's frail heart, that they could protect him where they'd failed Tommy. But fate was unkind. In the spring of 1985, a routine surgery to repair a valve in Brian's heart went wrong. Jane and Dave sat in the hospital waiting room, their hands clasped, the sterile smell of antiseptic burning their noses. "He's strong," Jane murmured, her voice a prayer, her eyes fixed on the door where doctors would emerge. Dave nodded, his jaw tight, but his fingers squeezed hers, betraying his fear. When the doctor appeared, his face ashen, Jane's heart plummeted. "Anaphylactic shock," he said, the words clinical, detached. "We did everything we could." Brian slipped into a coma, his small body still beneath the hospital sheets, and for 3 agonizing days, Jane and Dave kept vigil, their hands never leaving his whispering promises they couldn't keep. When the machines finally fell silent, Jane's scream echoed through the ward, raw and primal, while Dave sank to his knees, his face buried in his hands, unable to bear the sight of another child lost. The funeral was a haze of grief, the small church crowded with neighbors who didn't know what to say. Jane stood by Brian's coffin, her fingers tracing the edge of his favorite blue train now tucked beside him, a cruel reminder of the games he'd never play again. Dave stood apart, his eyes fixed on the stained glass window, as if searching for answers in the colored light. The house they returned to was no longer a home, but a hollow shell, its walls echoing with the absence of laughter. Brian's toys sat untouched on the living room shelf, his crayons scattered like relics of a life cut short. Tommy's crib, still in the nursery, stood as a monument to their failures. Jane moved through the days in a fog, her hands lingering on Brian's clothes, unable to pack them away, each fold a reminder of the warmth she'd never feel again. Dave retreated to the garage, his sanctuary where he'd sit with a beer, staring at the wall, the bottle untouched as his thoughts drowned in sorrow. Night after night, Jane wrestled with her guilt, the weight of it pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. She'd lie in bed clutching Brian's stuffed bear, its fur worn from his small hands, and whisper, "Mother's sorry, my babies. I couldn't keep you safe." The words were a ritual, a plea for forgiveness she didn't believe she deserved. Had she missed a sign with Tommy, a moment when she could have fought harder? Had she failed Brian by trusting the doctors, by believing his heart could endure? The questions circled her mind, relentless as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows like the restless spirits of her boys. Dave, unable to face their shared bed, slept on the couch, his snores a distant reminder that he too was slipping away, lost in his own grief. One night, as thunder rumbled over their Ohio town, Jane sat in the nursery, Tommy's blanket draped across her lap, its faint scent of baby powder, a cruel comfort. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking, the words spilling into the darkness. She didn't know who she was apologizing to. Tommy gone before he could truly live. Brian, her fragile light snuffed out. Dave crumbling under the weight of their loss, or herself for failing to hold their family together. The rain pounded harder, and she imagined Brian's soft footsteps in the hall, his voice calling Mommy. She closed her eyes, willing the sound to be real, but it was only memory, sharp and cutting. She buried her face in the blanket, her tears soaking the fabric, her body trembling with the ache of a mother who'd lost everything. Sleep, when it came, was no refuge. That same night, Jane dreamed, and the dream was a cold, suffocating thing. She was walking down a long hallway, its walls damp and mold-streaked, the air thick with the smell of decay. Flickering fluorescent lights cast jagged shadows, and her breath came in short, panicked gasps, her heart pounding as if it knew something she didn't. At the end of the hall, beneath an old iron bed, she saw them. Tommy and Brian, their clothes tattered, their faces pale and etched with fear. Tommy's eyes, wide and pleading, met hers. "Mommy, there's a little boy cold like us. Don't let him die like we did," he whispered, his voice faint like a breeze slipping through a cracked window. Brian, his small frame trembling, clutched her hand, his fingers icy. "He's scared, Mommy. You gotta save him." Jane's knees buckled, her eyes following their gaze to a third child, small and frail, half hidden in the shadows. His face was gaunt, but his eyes dark, shining achingly familiar, locked onto hers. They were Tommy's eyes, yet different, carrying a spark of hope so fragile it hurt to look at. He reached out his tiny hand, shaking his lips, forming words that pierced her soul. "Mommy, save me." The hallway seemed to close in the children's cries, echoing, blending with her own sobs. She reached for them, desperate to pull them close, but the dream dissolved and she woke gasping. Her chest tight, the boy's face burned into her mind. The rain still pounded outside, but the house felt different now, as if that dream had planted something, a seed of purpose, faint but undeniable. She sat up, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the bed. The boy's eyes, so like Tommy's, yet not, haunted her. Was it a message from her boys, a call to act, or just her grief twisting her mind? She didn't know, but the weight of those words, "save me," settled into her bones, heavy and urgent. She glanced at the empty space beside her where Dave no longer slept, and felt a pang of loneliness. He was hurting too, carrying his own scars, but this dream felt like hers, to carry a fragile thread, pulling her toward something she couldn't yet name. The next morning, Jane sat at the kitchen table, her coffee cold, her eyes red from sleeplessness. Dave shuffled in his flannel shirt, rumpled, his face drawn. "You look like you didn't sleep," he said, his voice gruff but tinged with concern. She hesitated, then poured out the dream, her words halting, each one heavy with the weight of what she'd seen. "It felt so real, Dave," she said, her voice breaking, "like they were trying to tell me something, like there's someone out there we're supposed to help." Dave's jaw tightened and he looked away, his fingers drumming on the table. "Jane, it's just a dream," he said, but his voice wavered, betraying his doubt. We're barely holding on. How are we supposed to save anyone else? She reached for his hand, her touch tentative, her eyes pleading. I know it's crazy, she said, but I can't let it go. Those boys, they're gone, but maybe this is their way of telling us to keep going. The dream had been so vivid, Tommy's faint whisper, Brian's trembling hand, and that other boy, his eyes hauntingly familiar, pleading for rescue. Jane's chest tightened at the memory, her breath catching, as she looked at Dave, willing him to understand. It wasn't just a dream. She said, her voice low but fierce. It felt like they were reaching out, like they're still with us, trying to guide us. Dave's jaw clenched, and he sank into the chair across from her, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. Jane, I hear you, he said, his voice rough like gravel. I know how much you're hurting, but taking in a kid, especially one with Down syndrome, that's a lot. We're barely keeping it together as it is. Money's tight. We're both worn out in our hearts. Jane, can we handle that kind of pain again? His voice broke, and he looked down, his hands trembling as they clenched into fists. Jane's heart ached at the fear in his eyes, the same fear that gnawed at her in the quiet hours when the house felt too big, too empty. She remembered Brian's small hand in hers, his weak smile calling her mommy, and Tommy's fleeting warmth gone before she could truly know him. The thought of another child, vulnerable and needing, sent a shiver through her, but it was the image of that boy in her dream alone, cold, reaching out, that burned brighter. I'm scared too, Dave, she said, her voice steady despite the tears, but I'm more scared of doing nothing. What if there's a child out there, lost like our boys were waiting for someone to care? You remember how Brian looked at you, how he'd light up when you walked in, or Tommy's tiny hand so cold at the end. If we can save even one kid from that kind of loneliness, I have to try. Her words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their shared loss, a plea wrapped in love and desperation. Dave closed his eyes, his face etched with lines deepened by grief. Memories flooded back, Brian's laughter, rare but bright, echoing through the house. Tommy's brief life, a flicker of hope, snuffed out too soon. He wanted to protect Jane, to shield her from more pain, but her words stirred something in him, a longing to make sense of their loss. After a long silence, he reached for her hand, his grip tight, his voice barely above a whisper. If this is how we keep Tommy and Brian with us, if this is what they're asking, then I'm in. Jane's breath caught, and she leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder, their tears mingling as they held on to each other, bound by a fragile promise to try again. The decision to adopt wasn't made lightly. Weeks passed, filled with paperwork, sleepless nights, and whispered doubts. Jane and Dave drove to the adoption agency in Columbus, their old pickup rattling along the highway, the air between them thick with anticipation and fear. The agency was a gray, squat building, its hallways reeking of disinfectant, the kind of smell that clung to your clothes and reminded you of hospitals. Inside, a small room held a handful of children, their laughter weak, their movements slow. Jane's eyes scanned the room, her heart pounding until they landed on a boy in the corner, his thin frame curled into itself, his dark hair falling over his face. Ben. His eyes, sad but bright, met hers, and Jane froze, her breath catching as if the world had shifted. He raised a trembling hand, a small gesture, and in that moment she saw the boy from her dream, those same pleading eyes, that same fragile hope. That's him, she whispered to Dave, her voice shaking. The boy from the dream. I know it. Dave followed her gaze, his heart twisting at the sight of the boy, so small, so alone. Jane stepped forward, her knees weak, and knelt beside Ben. His hand reached for hers, tentative, and when their fingers touched, Jane felt a jolt, as if Tommy and Brian were there guiding her. Dave, it's him, she said again, tears spilling down her cheeks. Those eyes, it's like they're calling me. Dave's throat tightened, and he squeezed her shoulder, his own eyes stinging. He saw it too, the echo of their boys in Ben's gaze, a chance to love again, to heal. They left the agency that day with a promise, their hearts heavy but lit with a flicker of purpose. Bringing Ben home was like stepping into a new life, one both familiar and terrifying. Jane fussed over him, her hands gentle as she tucked him into bed, her eyes tracing his every breath. Ben was quiet, his movements slow, his Down syndrome evident in the soft angles of his face, but his smile, rare and shy, felt like a gift. Dave took to sitting by Ben's bed each night, his big hands dwarfing the boy's small ones, his silence a vow to protect. The house, once a tomb, began to hum with small moments of life. Ben's soft giggles, the creak of the rocking chair as Jane sang to him. But beneath the warmth lay fear, a shadow that followed them, whispering of the fragility of hope. 7 months later, that fear became reality. Ben's heart, like Brian's, was weak, and the doctors recommended surgery, a risky procedure with a grim prognosis. 5% chance he'll make it to 10. The doctor said, his voice flat, as Jane and Dave sat in the sterile office, their hands clasped so tightly their knuckles turned white. Jane's tears fell silently, her mind replaying the losses of Tommy and Brian, each one a knife to her heart. Dave's face was a mask of pain, his voice barely audible as he asked, "What choice do we have?" The night before the surgery, Jane sat by Ben's hospital bed, her fingers stroking his hair, whispering, "You're strong, little man. You've got to stay with us." Dave stood by the window, his back to her, but she saw his shoulders shake, his grief a mirror of her own. The surgery was a blur of waiting, of coffee gone cold, and prayers whispered in desperation. When the doctor emerged, his face tired but hopeful, Jane's heart leapt. "He made it," he said, and Jane collapsed into Dave's arms, their sobs mingling with relief. In the recovery room, Ben lay still, his small chest rising and falling, his eyes fluttering open to reveal that same spark of hope. When he smiled, weak but real, Jane felt a warmth she hadn't known since Brian's laughter filled their home. Dave knelt beside the bed, his hand gentle on Ben's, and whispered, "You're our miracle, kid." They held each other, their tears a mix of joy and fear, believing perhaps for the first time that Tommy and Brian were watching their spirits woven into this fragile new beginning. The days that followed were a delicate balance of hope and vigilance. Jane watched Ben's every move, her heart catching at each cough, each faltering step. Dave, quieter, now took on the role of protector. His eyes soft when he looked at Ben, as if seeing their lost boys in the child they'd saved. The house began to feel like a home again, its walls no longer echoing with absence, but with the soft sounds of life. Ben's laughter, the clink of dishes as Jane cooked, the murmur of Dave's voice reading bedtime stories. They were healing slowly, painfully, but together. And in the quiet moments when Jane tucked Ben in, or caught Dave's eye across the room, she felt it a certainty that this was what Tommy and Brian had meant, that Ben was the boy they'd been called to save, the light that could guide them through the darkness of their grief. Since Ben's surgery, the Dalton house had begun to breathe again, its walls echoing with new life as Jane and Dave opened their doors to more children, each one with Down syndrome, each one carrying a story that broke and mended their hearts. Anya, a quiet girl from Ukraine with soulful eyes. Jack, whose mischievous grin could light up a room. Philip, gentle and shy. Marina, with her love for singing. And Molly, whose hugs were fierce and unguarded. Their laughter filled the house, a fragile melody that soothed the raw edges of Jane's grief, but beneath it, a quiet unease stirred a sense that their family's story was far from complete. Jane's hands trembled as she folded laundry, her mind drifting to the early days with Ben when hope was a tightrope they walked with cautious steps. Each new child brought joy, but also fear of loss, of not being enough, of history repeating itself. Dave, too, carried that weight, his broad shoulders slumping more with each adoption, though his eyes softened when he watched the children play. They'd built a family from their pain, each child a testament to the love they'd poured into Tommy and Brian. But Jane couldn't shake the feeling that their work wasn't done. The dream that had led them to Ben, those haunting images of her boys pleading for another child to be saved, still lingered, a whisper in her heart that grew louder with each passing day. That whisper became a shout during a trip to Ukraine in 1995 to adopt Anya. The orphanage was a cold, gray place, its walls peeling the air heavy with the smell of damp concrete and despair. Jane's stomach churned as she walked the halls, Dave's hand steady in hers, their steps echoing in the dim light. Children sat in corners, their eyes dull, their bodies small and hunched, as if the weight of the world had already broken them. One girl, no older than 5, curled up in a corner, her gaze so empty it sent a shiver through Jane, echoing the dream where Tommy's eyes had pleaded from the shadows. "This place. It's wrong," Jane whispered, her voice tight, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and resolve. Dave's grip tightened, his jaw set, and she knew he felt it too. The burning need to save these children, to keep their promise to Tommy and Brian. Back home, Anya settled in her quiet presence, a balm to the family. But Jane couldn't forget the orphanage the children left behind. She began to notice things, small, troubling things. Anya tired easily, her breathing labored at times, and Jack had unexplained bruises on his arms, faint but persistent. When she asked the agency for medical records, the documents were vague dates, mismatched diagnoses, incomplete. Jane's unease grew, a knot in her gut that tightened with each new piece of information. She started talking to other adoptive parents, her voice low over cups of coffee in church basements, their stories mirroring her own children with sudden illnesses records that didn't add up and whispers of neglect. Dave noticed it too, his eyes narrowing as he traced a bruise on Philip's wrist, his voice gruff with anger. "Something's not right, Jane. These kids, they're hurting, and nobody's saying why." One night, as the children slept, Jane sat hunched over a stack of medical files, her eyes burning from hours of reading. The kitchen was quiet, save for the hum of the fridge and the occasional creak of the house settling. Dave walked in, his boots heavy on the linoleum, and stopped when he saw her papers scattered across the table. "Jane, what are you doing to yourself?" he asked, his voice soft but edged with worry. She looked up, her eyes red, her hands shaking. "Dave, these kids, they're dying too young too often. Look at these files. Half of them don't make sense. And those bruises on Jack and Anya, they didn't just happen. If we don't speak up, who will?" Her voice broke, tears spilling down her cheeks, and Dave's heart twisted. He knelt beside her, his hand on hers, his own eyes glistening. "I'm with you, Jane," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "We'll find the truth, no matter what it takes." Their eyes met, a shared resolve sparking between them, a vow to turn their pain into purpose. The investigation began quietly, a slow unraveling of secrets that stretched across years. Jane and Dave drove across Ohio, meeting families who'd adopted from the same agencies, their stories a patchwork of grief and suspicion. They sat in living rooms cluttered with toys, listening to mothers weep over children lost to unexplained illnesses, fathers recounting odd gaps in medical histories. Jane took notes, her handwriting shaky but determined, each word a step closer to understanding. Dave, ever practical, tracked down former orphanage workers, his questions sharp, his patience thin. They pored over medical records, their kitchen table buried under files, coffee mugs cold from long nights of work. Some nights Dave faltered, his voice low as he admitted, "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Jane. It's too much." But Jane's eyes, fierce with the memory of Tommy and Brian, held him steady. "We're doing this for them," she'd say, her voice a quiet fire, and he'd nod, finding strength in her resolve. The truth emerged in fragments, each one a blow. They found forged medical reports, signatures that didn't match, and diagnoses that hid neglect. A former nurse, her hands trembling as she spoke, described children left hungry, their cries ignored in dark, locked rooms. Jane's heart stopped when she saw Anya's file, the faint scars on her arms matching the nurse's story of restraints used too often too tightly. Dave's anger flared, his fists clenched as he read accounts of children treated as commodities, their lives traded for profit in a network that spanned countries. "They're selling these kids," he said one night, his voice shaking with rage. "They're letting them suffer for money." Jane nodded, her tears falling onto a photo of Anya, her small face a reminder of why they couldn't stop. The weight of their findings grew heavier with each discovery, a burden that threatened to break them. Jane would wake in the night, her dreams filled with the faces of children she couldn't save, their voices echoing Tommy's and Brian's. Dave, too, carried the strain, his laughter with the children quieter, now his eyes distant as he wrestled with the horror of what they'd uncovered. Yet they pressed on, driven by a promise to their boys, to Anya, to every child whose story they held. They built a case piece by painstaking piece, their home, a war room of papers, and resolved their love for their children, the fuel that kept them going. In 2003, they stood before a packed conference room in Washington, D.C., the air thick with anticipation. The National Conference on Children's Rights was a sea of faces, advocates, policymakers, parents, all waiting to hear what Jane and Dave had found. Jane's hands shook as she stepped to the podium, her voice trembling but clear. "We lost our boys, Tommy and Brian, to illness and heartbreak," she said, her eyes scanning the room, finding strength in Dave's steady gaze from the front row. "But we can't stay silent about what we've seen. These children, our children, are being hurt, neglected, and sold. We have proof." She held up a folder, its pages heavy with evidence, photos of bruised arms, falsified records, testimonies from broken families. The room gasped, murmurs rippling through the crowd as Dave joined her, his voice low but fierce. "This has to stop," he said, his eyes burning with anger and hope. "For our kids, for all of them." The evidence they presented sent shockwaves through the room, then beyond. Newspapers ran headlines, activists rallied, and governments took notice. Orphanages linked to the network were investigated. Some shut down their doors, locked against further harm. Hundreds of children were moved to safer homes, their futures brighter because of Jane and Dave's fight. But for Jane, each victory was bittersweet, a reminder of the children they couldn't save, of Tommy and Brian, whose losses had set them on this path. They founded the Tommy Foundation, named for the son whose brief life had sparked their journey, its mission to protect vulnerable children, to give them the love and safety Jane and Dave had fought for. Back home, the Dalton house was alive again, filled with the voices of Ben, Anya, Jack, Philip, Marina, and Molly. Jane watched them play, her heart swelling at their laughter, but her eyes often drifted to the photos on the mantel, Tommy and Brian, their smiles frozen in time. She believed they were watching their spirits woven into every child they'd saved, every battle they'd fought. Dave, too, felt their presence, his hand resting on Jane's as they sat together, the weight of their grief lighter, now transformed into a purpose that burned bright. They'd turned their pain into a beacon, a light that pierced the darkest corners of the world, and in that light they found hope, not just for their family, but for every child who needed a chance to shine. The Ohio sun dipped low, casting a golden glow over the Dalton backyard, where laughter and the clink of glasses mingled with the hum of a summer evening in 2025. Jane, now in her late 60s, her hair streaked with silver, sat on the porch swing, her hands folded around a mug of tea, her eyes crinkling as she watched Ben, 30 years old and stronger than anyone had dared hope, chase a soccer ball with Jack and Marina. Anya, her quiet grace now tempered with confidence, was setting out plates for a family barbecue, while Philip and Molly, ever the helpers, arranged chairs, their laughter bright despite the challenges of their Down syndrome. The Tommy Foundation had grown from a dream born of grief into a beacon of hope, its work saving thousands of children from neglect and abuse, and Jane's heart swelled with a pride tinged with the ache of memory. Dave. His face weathered but softened by years of love settled beside her. His flannel shirt rolled up at the sleeves, a glass of lemonade in his hand. The years had etched lines into his face, but his eyes still held the steady warmth that had carried them through decades of pain and purpose. The backyard was alive with their family, not just the children they'd adopted, but the community they'd built, volunteers and families touched by the foundation's work, all gathered to celebrate its 20th anniversary. Ben, his heart surgery, a distant memory, kicked the ball to Jack, who whooped with delight, and Jane's thoughts drifted to the past, to the dream that had changed everything. "Remember that night, Dave?" she said, her voice soft, her gaze distant as she rocked the swing gently. "The dream I had with Tommy and Brian begging me to save that boy." Dave nodded his hand, finding hers, their fingers intertwining with the ease of a lifetime together. "How could I forget?" He said, his voice low, rough with emotion. "You woke up shaking, said you saw them clear as day, telling us to keep going. I thought you were half crazy, Jane, but that dream, it led us to Ben, to all of them." He gestured toward the yard where Anya was laughing with a volunteer, her Ukrainian accent softened by years in Ohio, and Molly was teaching a younger child to blow bubbles, her patience endless. Jane's eyes glistened, the memory of that cold, shadowed hallway in her dream, as vivid now as it was 30 years ago. Tommy's whisper, Brian's trembling hand, and that third boy, Ben, reaching out with eyes full of fragile hope. "I was so scared back then," she admitted, her voice catching. "After losing our boys, I didn't know if I had it in me to love again, to risk that kind of pain. But that dream, it was like they were telling us to keep fighting to save kids like them." She paused, her thumb tracing circles on Dave's hand, the weight of their journey settling between them. "We saved thousands, Dave. Thousands of kids who might have been lost like our boys." Dave's throat tightened, and he looked out at Ben, now helping Philip grill burgers, his laughter a sound that still felt like a miracle. "We didn't just save them," he said, his voice steady but thick with feeling. "They saved us, Jane. Ben, Anya, Jack, all of them. They gave us a reason to get up every morning, to keep going when it felt like the world was falling apart." He squeezed her hand, his eyes meeting hers, and in that moment, they saw it all. The grief of losing Tommy and Brian. The battles fought in cold orphanages, the nights spent poring over files, the triumphs at the conference in Washington, D.C., where their evidence had sparked change. The Tommy Foundation had grown beyond their wildest hopes, its shelters and advocacy programs stretching across states and even overseas, each one a testament to the love they'd poured into their boy's memory. Jane thought of the children they'd rescued, some now grown like Ben, living lives of quiet joy. Others, still young, safe in homes where they were cherished. She remembered the faces from Ukraine, the bruises on Anya's arms, the forged records, and the fierce resolve that had driven her and Dave to expose the truth. "We did it for them," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For Tommy and Brian. I feel them, Dave, in every kid we've helped, in every smile out there." Dave nodded, his eyes misty as he watched Marina dance with a sparkler, her laughter lighting up the dusk. "They're here," he said, his voice soft. "Every time Ben laughs, or Anya tells us about her day, or Jack pulls one of his pranks, I see our boys in them. That dream of yours, Jane, it wasn't just a dream. It was a promise." He leaned closer, his shoulder brushing hers, and they sat in silence. The weight of their shared past, a comfort, now not a burden. The backyard glowed with life, the air filled with the chatter of their family, and Jane felt a peace she hadn't known in years. A certainty that Tommy and Brian were watching, their spirits woven into every child they'd saved, every life they'd changed. As the stars began to speckle the sky, Ben wandered over his face, flushed from the game, his smile wide. "You two okay?" he asked, his voice gentle, his eyes those same eyes from Jane's dream, full of warmth. Jane reached for his hand, her heart full. "We're more than okay, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady. "We're home." And in that moment, surrounded by the family they'd built and the legacy they'd created, Jane knew the dream had been more than a vision. It had been a call, a light that had guided them through the darkness, saving not just thousands of children, but themselves. Hey friends, before we wrap up today's video, I just wanted to take a moment to share my own reflections on this incredible story we've just walked through together. You know, it's not just a tale of heartbreak and loss, though there's plenty of that. It's also a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the way love can rise from the deepest grief and turn pain into purpose. This story of Jane and Dave is a reminder that even in the darkest times, when every breath feels heavy with sorrow, there's a chance for hope to break through. Their journey from losing not just one but two precious children and then finding the strength to open their hearts again shows us the true meaning of compassion. That single dream Jane had with her sons pleading to save another child sparked a flame that ended up saving countless lives. It's as if in that dream God himself reached out and gave her a purpose she couldn't ignore. For me, that's the most beautiful part of this story, the way faith and love intertwined to bring light into the lives of so many children who might have otherwise been forgotten. Jane and Dave didn't just honor their lost boys. They became a beacon for kids all around the world. That's the kind of love that truly reflects God's heart. Love that goes beyond words, beyond pain, and into action. I'd love to hear what you think about this story. Do you see echoes of your own journey here? How does Jane's dream speak to you? Drop a comment below and let's share our thoughts together. Thanks for joining me on this journey, friends. Stay blessed, and I'll see you in the next one.